you, Martin, and it's a privilege to join you all this morning. I actually have a very long association with CMCS. Many years ago, I studied at the University of Edinburgh with Martin and also with Ida Glaser. And that's actually where I think I'd like to start in terms of my presentation this morning. When I was a student at Edinburgh, my wife and I invited some Muslim classmates over for a meal, and we did not prepare a halal meal for various reasons. We had been advised by a friend that not all Muslims are concerned as to whether a meal is halal or not. But when they arrived, and it was a Sunni classmate and a Shiite classmate who came. We felt like, well, we should at least tell them that the meal was not halal. And so when we did, we received differing responses from my classmates. My Sunni classmate said that on the basis of a Quranic verse, and she named it, that gave believers, as in Muslims, permission to eat with people of the book, with Jews and Christians, that she'd be willing to go ahead and eat this meal that was not halal. My Shiite classmate politely declined, and she didn't really give us a reason. And and so what we decided to do at that point was to quickly make a vegetarian meal and get around the issue altogether. What that experience though did for me was I began to realize that as a Christian, if I was to relate to Muslims, I needed to learn more about the various, as it were, denominations within Islam. And that has begun a very long journey. Let me fast forward a number of years. I was studying Arabic at the Mahad Qasid, which is in Jordan. And I discovered that even though it's a Sunni institute, one of my classmates was Shiite, and he was being very careful not to publicize that information. The reason is that he wanted to study tajweed, which is the correct pronunciation and also intonation of the Quran. And it's an art in Islam. And I realized that he was afraid that if it was discovered that he was Shiite studying at a Sunni institute, that he would be denied that privilege or the possibility of studying tajweed. And that also kind of opened my eyes. But he was willing to share this or share his identity with me because I was a Christian and I had no kind of stake in this issue. And so he opened up to me in a way that he did not open up to many of his own Muslim classmates. These personal encounters with Muslims have therefore shaped my research questions. And that is, just generally speaking, how does the Sunni-Shia divide impact Muslim relationships with Christians? My first encounter is kind of reflective of the influence of law, okay? And particularly law that in that case came from the Quran. There isn't as much about law in the Quran as, say, that you find, for instance, in the Hadith. But nonetheless, that verse, which actually comes from Surah Al-Ma'idah, has been very influential, especially when it comes to Muslim-Christian relations as far as meals are concerned, for instance. The second counter reflects the influence, I think, of what I would say, of environment. Okay, and thus it had more unpredictable results. Okay, it's not just a matter of law, but it's also a matter of what is happening on the ground, what is happening in that relationship in particular. The Sunni-Shia divide is of course, as many of us know, a largely political one, but it's not exclusively political. For those of you who are not familiar with it, the divide occurred after the time of the Prophet, where you have especially his son-in-law Ali disagreeing with the policies of Muawiyah, who was part of the family of part of the Quraysh, so the general tribe of the Prophet, and it also stems from simply that there was no provision that was made for a leader. At least, well, it depends on who you talk to, but that there was no provision for a successor to the Prophet, and so you have a civil war that eventually breaks out at the time of Ali. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Shiism then has it's a movement that didn't form immediately, but there has been a significant minority of Muslims who have insisted that Ali and his descendants were robbed of their rightful rule of the caliphate. After the first three caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali ruled as caliph from the year 656 to 661. But as I said, his caliphate was contested by Muawiyah. And following the Battle of Siffin in 657, he was outmaneuvered and eventually assassinated. Ali's descendants were never able to wrest control of the caliphate away from Muawiyah. His descendants became the Umayyads, and the Umayyads were later replaced by the Abbasids. It's not until you have to get to the early 10th century that you have the first Shiite caliphate, the caliphate of the Fāṭimids. The Fāṭimids were named after Fāṭima, who was the daughter of Muhammad, and also she was the wife of Ali. And as I said, this was the first Shiite caliphate to be created. It was also the first to compete with the dominant Sunni caliphate of the Abbasids in the East. And you can see that in the early 900s, the Fāṭimids were much bigger, in fact. They had much more territory, all of North Africa and Egypt, as well as Syria, and they also controlled Mecca and Medina. So they were, in fact, a serious threat to the Abbasids, which had been the dominant Sunni caliphate. The Fāṭimids, actually, let me go ahead and move on to Fāṭimid law. Fāṭimid law was the very first, as it were, essay of Shiites, okay, in Islamic law. And Al-Qadi al-Nu'man, who died in 974, was really the founder of Fāṭimid law. He was an Ismaili missionary the Ismailis were Seveners, meaning they were Muslims who believed that there were 7 imams who followed from Ali. And Al-Qadi Nu'man wrote the Pillars of Islam, which is, as I said, the foundational legal work for the Fāṭimid Empire. The Fāṭimid Caliph Al-Mu'iz, who died in 975, it was the caliph who commissioned Al-Qadi Nu'man to write the Pillars of Islam. Al-Qadi Nu'man initially trained as a Maliki jurist in Cairo I, which is now in Tunisia. He's only later embraced Ismaili Shiism, but he had the knowledge necessary to set up a school of law for the Fātimids. Up to that point, you had, well, even to this day, you have 4 Sunni schools of law, but you didn't have a Shiite school of law until Al-Qadi Nu'man was commissioned by Al-Mu'iz to do so. The Pillars of Islam is in many ways a work of propaganda that seeks to make the Shia imamate legitimate as a competitor to the Sunni schools of law. Al-Qadi Nu'man emphasized traditions in which, in his book, he emphasized traditions in which the Prophet Muhammad gives his son-in-law Ali priority over all other companions. And so he's therefore rather critical of Umar. Even to this day, you have some imams in Shiite mosques criticizing Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman. And Al-Qadi Nu'man certainly does this in his Pillars of Islam. Particularly, he disparages Umar for failing to fairly distribute resources, or spoils of war within the Muslim community. There's a tradition in which 2 leaders in the Muslim community, Talha and al-Zubair, ask Ali, who at the time was caliph, to permit them more than their fair share of booty or spoil. And he cites Umar's previous permission to do so, and Ali refuses. There's also a tradition in which the Prophet asked his companions to kill a Muslim who was not distributing booty fairly. And only Ali agrees to do this. Umar using the excuse that the man was praying, and thus he could not carry out the act. Al-Qadi Nu'man also portrays Umar as an incapable and ignorant judge. There's a tradition in which Umar warns his people to, quote, not be excessive in what is given to women in charity. Whereupon a woman standing near the back of the assembly challenges him with a surah from Al-Nisa 4, chapter 4:20. If you have given them a sum of money, take nothing from it. And this silences Umar. There's also a tradition in which Umar wanted to punish a woman who gave birth within 6 months of marriage. But Ali stops him, and he quotes 2 Quranic verses that appears to support a minimum period of pregnancy of being 6 months. Finally, there's a tradition in which Ali prevents Umar from stoning a woman for adultery, and challenges Umar that he has no right over the child in her womb. Okay, so Umar is being the second caliph, right, is portrayed as someone who's incompetent, both as a judge and also unfair in how he governs the community. The criticism of Al-Qadi Nu'man of Umar is in part a wider campaign to portray Sunni jurists as being grossly inept in their decision-making when compared with the rulings of the imams. Al-Qadi Nu'man cites a tradition in which he says the companions are like the stars, and that whoever one chooses to follow, he'll be rightly guided. But then he corrects that tradition to say that no, it's actually not the companions, it's the imams who are like the stars. He's also, in his book, he's critical of the founders of three schools of Sunni law, of Abu Hanifa, of Malik ibn Anas, and al-Shafi. All of it, he says, all of them were ready to change their opinions if they came across a better one. Meaning that the imams were reliable when these eponyms of these Sunni schools of law were not. He also mentions Abu Hanifa. He says one does not need to judge by analogy, for that was how Iblis reasoned that fire was nobler than clay. This is a reference back to the Quran, and that this entitled him not to bow before Adam as God had commanded. So you can see that there's quite a bit of animosity here that Al-Qadi Nu'man is showing toward his Sunni sort of interlocutors, if you were. Okay, what does Al-Qadi Nu'man say about dhimmis, in particular, Christians and Jews living under Fāṭimid rule? He first places them in a category that is legally inferior to Muslims. That's not surprising. He quotes Ja'far as-Sadiq, who says it's not proper for a Muslim believer to act in partnership with dhimmi, to give him money or even his sincere affection. Now, is this because dhimmis are not trustworthy, or because they shouldn't have financial or political power? There's a tradition that the Prophet accepted the jizya, the poll tax from dhimmis, so long as they didn't practice usury or the taking of interest. But that if a dhimmi was found guilty of that, then he lost his protection. That's a possibility that wasn't trustworthy. But there's also the possibility that he shouldn't have power. There's a tradition that Ja'far as-Sadiq would not, who was one of the 7 imams, would not permit a dhimmi to buy out his Muslim partner's shares, though a Muslim could buy out a non-Muslim's partner's shares. So you can see there's an argument to be made for power relations there. Al-Qadi Nu'man also holds that the dhimmis are not only inferior to Muslims, but they're also greatly compromised in their ritual purity. There's a tradition that Ja'far as-Sadiq instructed Muslims not to eat the food of Jews, Christians, and Majus, who were Zoroastrians, but he did permit them to eat the food of ritually impure Muslims. He cites another tradition of the Prophet that prohibited Muslims from praying in clothes that were worn by Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians. And then there's also, in Al-Qadi Nu'man's work, a focus on ritual purity that differs from Sunni views of Jews and Christians. For Sunnis viewed Jews and Christians to be people of the book, and thus, while they weren't believers, they weren't necessarily unbelievers either. This is coming from David Friedenreich, the scholar David Friedenreich. So you have a concern for ritual purity in Shiism that is not as strong in Sunni Islam, at least in my reading of Al-Qadi Nu'man. He also stipulates that it is the imam or the caliph, and i.e. a descendant of Ali, and he only who may govern dhimmis. In a kind of a guide for princes that Al-Qadi Nu'man inserts into his book, he stipulates it's the rightful imam, i.e. Ali's descendant, who can judge in controversial matters, who may make treaties with unbelievers, and who's due the fifth of spoils collected from enemies who have surrendered to Muslims. Furthermore, there's a tradition that the Prophet gave his daughter Fāṭimid the town of Fadak, and he accuses Umayyad and Abbasid caliphs then of wrongfully stealing Fadak from Ali's descendants. Okay, Al-Qadi Nu'man also cites a tradition that effectively links his Sunni Abbasid enemies with Jews. There's a tradition that anyone, quote, who bears malice toward the Ahl al-Bayt, the people of the house, meaning the Prophet and his family, will be raised on the day of resurrection a Jew. And this is not a complimentary statement. The man who does this, even if he pronounces the Shahada, he says, will still be deemed to be a Jew. Okay, finally, Al-Qadi Nu'man affirms the responsibility of the imam to protect the persons and property of dhimmis. There's a tradition that Muawiyah's horsemen, and Muawiyah again being the first of the Umayyads, and the enemy of Ali, were attacking the town of Anbar on the Euphrates. And these men raped and stole jewelry from a Muslim woman and her dhimmi servant. Ali says that if a Muslim who did such a thing were to die for this, he would hold him deserving of his death. Now, in other words, the fact that these Muslims have done this, okay, and they were, again, the enemies of Ali, that they killed a dhimmi as well as a Muslim woman. They are deserving of death for this. Okay, here's the larger question. Did any of these traditions or legal considerations have any impact on Muslim-Christian relationships in the Fāṭimid Empire? It's one thing to consider kind of the legal framework and some other rhetoric. Is there any evidence in the history of the Fāṭimid Empire that these sentiments actually were carried over, were implemented in, either in law or in action? Do we see any hatred of Umar, any jealousy of Sunni governance of dhimmis, concern over the social standing or financial power of dhimmi? Or conversely, do we see a concern to protect the persons and properties of dhimmi? What I have done is I've especially mined the resources of al-Maqrizi, who was writing well after the time of the Fātimids, but who had some Shiite sympathies and a strong interest in the Fātimids. He himself was Egyptian. And I've looked particularly at the reign of four different, the reigns of four different caliphs in Fāṭimid Empire, but particularly during the end of the 10th century and of course of the 11th. This preceded the coming of the Crusaders in Palestine, and I'll go ahead and share with you what I've found. Starting with the reign of Al-Aziz at the end of the 10th century. Al-Aziz developed a reputation for favoring Jews and Christians over Muslims when it came to his governmental appointments. Al-Maqrizi quotes a poet, for instance, who is so angry Al-Aziz appointed the Jew Yaqub bin Kilis to the post of wazir, as well as a Christian, Fadl bin Saleh, as a qa'id or commander of his army. The poet ends his poem with an especially provocative line, saying that Yaqub the wazir is the father, Al-Aziz is the son, and the Holy Spirit is Fadl. Okay, what seems to be happening here is he's mocking Christianity, but he's faulting Al-Aziz for favoring the dhimmis. You see? He seems to have been a Sunni who was very unhappy with what the Shiite caliph was doing when it came to Christians and to Jews. Al-Makrizi is skeptical as well that Al-Aziz was so biased toward dhimmis, I should say. He points out that Al-Aziz at one point arrested both Yaqub and Fadl, and that he confiscated money from them. That he also held them for 2 months in prison. So it's actually much more. It's not nearly so clear, as it were, but that Al-Aziz always favored dhimmis, but it certainly seems to have been an issue. Al-Aziz also issued a highly restrictive measure on Christians during a political and military low, when tensions over what was happening in Palestine were running high. His general Jawhar was defeated in Palestine in the year 977 by Al-Hakem, who declared himself for the Abbasids. And angry about this defeat, Al-Aziz then fired Jawhar. So this goes back to the environmental conditions that I mentioned at the beginning of this seminar, where what is happening on the ground can influence how one is relating to the other. Then, just before leading his own army out to challenge, Al-Aziz prohibited Christians from observing and participating in Layl al-Gitas, which was a baptismal holiday in which Christians gathered at the water's edge, at the Nile in particular, and played musical instruments. Okay, moving to the reign of El Hakkem. El Hakkem is known by some as the Mad Caliph. He is the most infamous caliph in Fāṭimid history for various reasons. Some think one of his own physicians even thought that he was insane. But he is known especially for destroying the Church of the Holy Sepulcher in the year 1009. And this becomes a talking point during the Crusades, that the Muslims are attacking the most sacred site of Christianity, and so therefore they need to be fought. After receiving a report about, so why did, the question is, why did Al Hakkem destroy the Church of the Holy Sepulcher? After receiving a report about the miracle of the Holy Fire, which is an annual event in which a fire is lit inside the Holy Sepulcher right before Easter. Al Hakkem ordered his da'i, his missionary, Ahmad bin Yaqub, to destroy the church. Now, the claim in the Holy Sepulcher is that this fire is lit miraculously, and Makrizi suggests an alternative to this miracle of the holy fire. That it is in fact just simply kind of secretly set by the Christians. And so this report then from the Dai becomes, as it were, the reason for why the church should be destroyed. Now, why order a Dai to do this rather than a military general? The Dai's purpose was to turn supporters of the Abbasids into rulers loyal to the Fāṭimids. Al-Hakkem wanted only, what I argue here is Al-Hakkem wanted only the most loyal of Muslims to do this task. Now, were Al-Hakkem's actions really due to madness? The scholar Jennifer Pruitt has argued that Al-Hakkem's actions were actually intentional, that they were not the result of madness. And that early in his reign, Al-Hakkem was hostile to both Sunnis and to Muslims, or to Sunnis and to Christians. But when a Sunni named Abu Raqwa, who was claiming to be a descendant of the Umayyads, rebelled and marched on Cairo in 1005, the Alhakem changed his tactics. What he wanted to do, he wanted to win Sunni loyalty in the Fāṭimid Caliphate by then unleashing a general persecution of Christians. And the Holy Sepulcher, which was a church that had irked Muslims due to its prominence in Jerusalem, then became a target. Okay, was Al-Hakkem seeking to destroy the Mosque of Umar at the same time that he ordered the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulcher? That's a possibility. Umar bin al-Khattab, who was the conqueror of Jerusalem in the year 637, is said to have refused the worship in the Church of the Holy Sepulcher for fear, he refused to worship there for fear that the church might be turned into a mosque when he first arrived there in the 7th century. And instead, he prays on the southeastern steps of the church, outside the church. There's a mosque then that was built in his honor to remember this event. And one question that I'm asking in my own research is, was Al-Hakkem essentially only too happy to destroy that mosque at the same time that he destroyed the church? Was there an incentive there to do that? Sorry, I just realized I should have been going through those. Okay, finally, there's another detail in Al-Hakkem's reign where he dresses dhimmis in black rather than in yellow. He issues an order in regards to this. And what he seems to be doing here is he seems to be putting Jews and Christians in the same category as the Abbasids. Black was the color of the Abbasids. And typically, that this was not, in the Abbasid realm, for instance, this was not a color that the Christians wore. The Abbasids would not let the Medes wear black or blue, as that was reserved for Muslims. But Al-Hakkem orders that they be dressed in black. So he seems to be associating dhimmis with the Abbasids. Okay, I know, how's our time, Martin? I know what we're,
yeah, another 10 minutes, 5-10 minutes would be fine.
Okay. Moving on to the reign of Al-Zahir, the third caliph, who reigned from 1021 to 1036. Relative to Al-Hakkem especially, Al-Zahir appears to have been benign toward the Medes. He allows them, for instance, to celebrate Layl al-Qitas, which you remember Al-Aziz did not. And he also permitted the reopening of the Church of the Holy Sepulcher in the year 1028, in exchange for the reopening of a mosque in Constantinople. So there was a political connection there. I should just mention the Holy Sepulcher was a church that was supported financially as well as kind of morally by Constantinople at that time. It was a Byzantine or Orthodox what's the word I'm looking for? Protectorate is the word. Okay, in the year 1025, or 50 years after his grandfather Al-Aziz had prohibited Lyle and Gitaz, Al-Zahir actually even watched. Not only did he permit it, but he watched the festival approvingly from his palace. When some of the Muslims called on him to prohibit Muslims and Christians from mixing next to the river, Al-Zahir ordered his lieutenant to light up the water's edge at night with long-lasting torches and then guard the Christians while they performed these baptisms. So he seems to have anticipated that that these Christians could be attacked, and he proactively guards them. This event followed fighting, I should say, in Syria and Palestine by a rebel who had secretly been provoked by a Christian in the Fāṭimid administration. Okay, so there was a reason, an environmental reason for actually persecuting Christians, but Zahir does not do this. Okay, he in fact intentionally protects the Christians. Moving on to the reign of Al-Mustansir in the year 1036 to 1094. He was one of the longest reigning Fāṭimid caliphs. During his time, the Byzantines took advantage of a Sunni rebellion in Ifriqiya in Tunisia in 1051 to invade the land. Okay, so this is again, it's the background, as it were, to some of what of his policies toward Jews and Christians. Okay, and this action then drove the rebel Mu'iz bin Badis back to Al-Mustansir to reconcile with him. In the western Fāṭimid province of Ifriqiya, Mu'iz bin Badis then changes his loyalty from the Fātimids to the Abbasids. And in the first case, the Fātimids were able to buy back his loyalty. But in the second one, the Byzantine emperor capitalized on Sunni-Shia divisions to launch an invasion of Ifriqiya. Mu'iz then sent a message to Al-Mustansir reaffirming his loyalty to the Fātimids, at which point he burned his compact with the Abbasids in a pit. Okay, so let me actually, since our time is short here, let me just move on to the next example of Mustansir. The Empress Theodora in Byzantium decided to allow the mosque in Constantinople to honor the Abbasids rather than the Fātimids from the minbar, the pulpit, in Constantinople. And this prompts Al-Mustansir to punish Christian dhimmis living under Fātimid rule. In 1055, the Turkish Seljuk Sultan Tughlobek convinced Theodora to allow the mosque in Constantinople to redirect the khutbah or the sermon to the Abbasid caliph rather than to Al-Mustansir. And like so, this made him so angry that he ordered the arrests and the exile of the Patriarch of Jerusalem. He locked up all the churches in Egypt and in Syria, and he demanded the jizya from monks for 4 years, which then increased the amount of the jizya on all the Christians in the land. And so here's a pretty clear example of how the Sunni-Shia divide, if it in this case, Al-Mustansir perceived the the Byzantine Christians to be taking the side of the Abbasids. Okay, because Theodora allowed this to happen. Okay, let's move to some conclusions here. First of all, Fāṭimid jurisprudence did impact caliphal attitudes toward dhimmis, but it may not be possible to draw a direct line from the law book to the action. Do we see hatred of Umar in the historical record? Well, we do see Alhakem targeting what the Churchill Holy Sepulcher, and very possibly the Mosque of Umar. I mean, that is debatable, but it's a possibility. Do we see jealousy of Sunni governance of dhimmis? Okay, as we saw in Al-Qadi Nu'man's work. Well, we see al-Mustansir's anger over the khutbah in Constantinople, honoring the Abbasids. Do we see concern over the social standing of financial power of dhimmis? Or conversely, a concern to protect the persons of dhimmis? Well, we see anger over al-Aziz's appointments. And we also find al-Zahir protecting Christians during Baal al-Hitas. So I want to suggest that there is some evidence for the law book impacting the way these Muslim caliphs are relating to the Christian dhimmi. Now, that said, the right to rule over all, Muslims, Christians, and Jews is what the Fāṭimid caliphs pursued most vigorously. And it's which led the caliphs to become so angry, as we've seen, when the Abbasids challenged that claim. In other words, law is of importance, but it's not necessarily what always guides the actions of the caliphs. Relationships are not defined by rules only, but by the environments in which those rules operate. And while Fāṭimid caliphs were familiar with those rules, political concerns were often paramount. And this brings me back to the very beginning of my presentation, when I talked about how I really encounter both. In my first encounter with my Sunni and Shia classmates, the law seems to have been what was kind of top most in mind, as it were, for my Sunni and Shia classmates. In the second account, or in my second experience, it was really more just the environment in which we were, and the fact that my Shia classmate felt like he could really trust me. In that case, because I had no stake in him taking or not taking Tajweed. Okay, thanks very much. I'll go ahead and open it up for Q&A.